Nelson Institute, but I have just accepted a position as co-executive director of the South Big Data Hub at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is one of 4 regional hubs around the country sponsored by the National Science Foundation. So I'd like to, thank you. I'd like to start briefly by providing kind of my interpretation of open science and innovation, because I've seen talks at various conferences where people take different pieces of it, and I'm a very big tent kind of person. So in addition to open access journals and open data, and I want to emphasize that open data by itself, we need to make sure that it's also findable and usable. Open source software, of course, but also shared computing infrastructure and services. And that could be things like iRods, which is an integrated distributed data management software that allows research groups from diverse locations to easily access data sets. Open hardware, as we've talked a lot about at this workshop. I'm going to emphasize on my talk open collaboration, so citizen science and crowdsourcing approaches. But I also want to emphasize things like human computation, but I meant to write human-centered design, because that's an important element of engaging the crowd in our work. And science communication. So as scientists, we often forget to put things in plain English so that policymakers and the general public can understand what we're discussing. So just to put us all on the same page, I'm going to give a brief definition as we've defined it in the U.S. federal government on citizen science, so drawing from the scientific literature, particularly Bonney et al., or Shirk et al., and others. But again, big tent. Citizen science is engaging the public, members of the public, or it could be a bounded group of trusted experts in identifying the research questions, designing and conducting the investigations, collecting and analyzing the data. Often we emphasize the data collection part, but we are moving towards getting the crowd to help solving complex problems and developing new technologies. So the European Union also has defined citizen science fairly similarly. But I want to emphasize that citizen science intersects with many other different open collaboration approaches, including volunteer monitoring or participatory sensing, volunteer geographic information, prizes and challenges, serious games, and making. And that's probably not a complete list. So it runs the gamut from photography, sample specimen collection, getting GPS coordinates, to helping with the image analysis, the data entry, transcribing data, annotating text. Again, I said, I'm hoping we are moving in the direction of true problem solving like Foldit. Why consider citizen science? Well, it increases the spatial and temporal frequency of the data that we can collect. It can increase the geographic extent or the temporal scale of our projects. Sometimes the eye is better than the algorithm, right? So if we have images of galaxies and we want to figure out how they're classified, the human eye can be better at some of that pattern recognition than some of our algorithms. It also can reduce time and labor costs, so we can expand the scale of our projects that we might not otherwise be able to do. For example, the Zooniverse Project Galaxy Zoo engaged millions of volunteers to categorize 40 million galaxies. So can you imagine doing that many categorizations? But citizen science isn't right for every scientific problem. We do emphasize in the U.S. federal government the appropriate use of this approach. So 4 or 5 years ago, when I started the Commons Lab at the Wilson Center and then moved to NASA as a Presidential Innovation Fellow, I had talked to several agencies about their potential interest in these approaches. And there was interest, but then there was concern. And the things I've heard frequently is, well, what about the data quality? What about the privacy? There's a lot of regulations in the federal government that have to be addressed if you're going to do these kind of projects. So we conducted a study. We looked at 4 different agencies, interviewed about 6 to 10 people per agency, and asked them, what were some of the barriers they were facing? How were they overcoming them? And this list here, across the board, from staff level to executive director, privacy, liability, staffing. So U.S. federal agencies are under oversight from the press, from Congress, from a lot of litigation. So often they're very concerned about using these approaches. So then we set about trying to figure out how to overcome these risks, to address the barriers and reduce the resistance. First, while I was at the Wilson Center, we served as a bridge organization, or as a connector. So I went about talking to people in agencies and identifying the champions at the staff level and at the executive level. You know, one person in HHS were using these approaches in this department, someone over in this department was using it, but they didn't know each other existed, or they didn't know that someone else in this other agency was doing the same kind of work they were doing. So we began to bring these people together, to connect them so that they could share their experiences. What I have found in government is they like to see that someone else in government has already done it and already worked through the barriers. So finding some of the best practices case studies, and we put together what I call a picture book, and I drew on the geospatial world, which 20 years ago faced the same issues. So we came up with 17 projects that exemplified the range in which the crowd could participate, and a range of themes or applications from broadband mapping to transcribing historical records to climate monitoring. And we created, for each project, a template. So what was the problem they were trying to solve? Who was involved? What were the challenges they were facing? How did they overcome them? And what was the impact, either the scientific impact, the education, or the policy impact? And actually, getting that information was like pulling teeth, getting people to think about what was the downstream impact that they had. And then we created a data visualization, or a photo of the volunteers, or something to catch the eye. And it was all written in plain English, and we got a lot of attention and traction with this. We held a workshop, brought together, I think it was more than 100 people, standing room only, from across the agencies, from the private sector, from practitioners. We had the White House come, we had a deputy administrator come, so high-level endorsement that these approaches we should be considering. A lot of energy and excitement in the room, and that planning group that I brought together to make that workshop, when we debriefed at the end of the workshop, decided we should continue this. We should form a more formal federal community of practice on crowdsourcing and citizen science. I want to call out Jennifer Couch, she was there at the beginning, helping us to move this forward. So we started, I think it was like 8 to 10 people from 3 or 4 agencies, and now after 2 years have grown to more than 200 people from more than 35 agencies. So we also work to align with priorities. Often citizen science is considered niche, right? I can't tell you the number of times I've heard it's niche. So how do we align it with the open government initiatives, with the open data initiatives, and other priorities of the administration? So we got it included in the President's Open Government National Action Plan, highlighting several projects that the federal agencies had conducted. We also sought out top-level support. So over time, having multiple meetings with White House staff and agency leadership to get them to keynote at events, to write public blog posts that then agency staff could take to their middle managers and say, look, we have top-level support. This comes from the top of the agency, or this comes from the White House. We worked to create some policy guidance materials, so we worked closely with the White House to build in citizen science and crowdsourcing in the President's Strategy for American Innovation, to draft a memo that John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, released, which I'll talk about in a moment. Again, creating a written record that agency staff could point to say this is something that's supported, and then here's guidance on how to appropriately use it in the government. So the Holdren memo, we set out a set of 3 core principles. So this was actually, we drew from the European Union's Citizen Science Association in Europe that had set out 10 core guiding ethical principles. Because we had to get consensus of every single agency and multiple offices of the White House for this, it came down to 3 fundamental principles. But that included fitness for purpose of the data, right? So if it's for education versus scientific research, you may have different kind of standards of data quality. Openness, of course, transparency, open data, all those things we think about around openness. And most importantly, meaningful public participation, right? What I saw early on, 4 or 5 years ago, was like, oh, let's all do hackathons and let's do data paloozas just for the mere fact of doing it, right? The buzz, the excitement. But no, we really want the public to contribute meaningfully, right? Where can they contribute in unique ways that we couldn't do otherwise? There were some requirements in the memo, but again, we're trying to keep it rather minimum. We don't want to create undue burden on agencies. And that's essentially to identify some agency coordinators or liaisons. It could be a point of contact, so as people say, oh, how do I get started? They have someone to reach out to, and then for cross-agency coordination. One of the big efforts is we created a toolbox, right? So what we often heard is people didn't know how to get started. So 125 of our federal staff members with zero budget over the course of a year built a toolkit, online toolkit, that agencies and actually anyone could go to and get step-by-step instructions on how to get started, on get links to key resources. So not the kitchen sink, but here's the 3 or 4 top scientific papers or working papers or websites that you could go to figure out how to address volunteer management or data management or data quality assurance. One of the big barriers in the U.S. is the legal issues. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to run through this quick. So we commissioned several legal studies looking at issues of privacy, issues of intellectual property. So those were published by the Wilson Center, and Elizabeth Tyson, I don't know if she's in the room, helped to guide that through. Yay. We worked with congressional staff to get legislation that's still pending to help clarify some of the legal issues. We worked to increase funding opportunities, and now they're launching to build a database of projects to increase the searchability of federal projects. As I said, there's a range of examples in the federal government that we could point you to, but new technologies, new sensors are creating new opportunities. I want to highlight EPA, which is working with local communities to do an instrument loan program, to create grants for communities to purchase these instruments, to connect scientists to these communities to help them interpret the data. They're also beginning to prototype and test and evaluate some of these instruments. We also work to build citizen science into some of the national policies, so like the National Climate Assessment, the National Civil Earth Observation Strategy and Plan, and that last one took 4 years to get them to begin to think about, so this is not an overnight process. I want to point out in Europe, we commissioned Mookie Hockley to look at how citizen science was impacting policy in Europe, so the Wilson Center has published that. And then if I get help with the video, Stephen very nicely called out the Louisville example of Propeller Health, and I sit on the advisory board of Crowd in the Cloud, which is going to be a made-for-PBS TV series on citizen science, and they kindly put together a rough cut for me of their videotape of Louisville and the use of citizen science. I figured that. I heard you read them over there. You knew it. One.
My name is Mason. I am 9.
Louisville, Kentucky is one of the U.S.'s asthma hotspots. Like Mason, 13% of the city's population suffers from the disease.
We typically make it to the tops of lists that people don't want to be on the tops of. So, the 4th highest rate of asthma nationally. One of the 10 worst places to live if you have breathing disorders, and allergies. I mean, we've looked at some of these lists and the people that make them and said, our goal is to get off your list.
One of the first calls Ted made was to David Van Sickle, CEO of Propeller Health. Van Sickle's company was developing a sensor to track the inhaler use of asthma patients.
We had this idea that chips and sensors and radios had become small and cheap enough that they can now be, actually physically built into the medications that people take.
It took a couple tries and a few clunky prototypes, but Propeller's current sensor fits seamlessly on top of a typical inhaler.
So the Propeller sensor is this device. It attaches to a patient's existing medication and then passively tracks when the medicine is used and sends that information on to a smartphone.
Asthma is a lonely disease. We don't talk about it very often. If you're a non-asthmatic, then you don't have to think about breathing. When you're an asthmatic, breathing is exhausting. I track all of these medicines with the Propeller app on my iPhone. Every time I use my inhaler, it sends a signal to the phone, to the app, and it logs it for me. It gives me all kinds of details. It tells me how many days in the last month that I've had symptoms, how many times I've used my rescue inhaler this week. It tells me the last several months how compliant I've been with my daily meds.
they don't have to remind themselves or think through the fact that they're ill, you know. So we're trying to essentially accomplish that work for them.
It lets you see a trend of how the patient is doing. If a patient's trend is typical to use their inhaler, let's say prior to exercise, and we know that, but then all of a sudden you see a couple of days where that rescue inhaler usage climbs. Now they've used it 2 or 3 times in the last couple of days. It allows us to outreach to the patient to kind of see what is going on. Is there an issue that we can catch prior to them getting to that point and making it to the ER?
With that, thank you very much.